The midday sun blazed over the imperial gates of Orion Palace, its golden rays dancing on the polished stone walls and intricate carvings. Tourists milled about, their voices a soft murmur as they admired the towering spires and opulent architecture. Among them stood Elias Grant, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Clad in the ceremonial uniform of the Orion Guard, complete with gleaming buttons and a crimson sash, he was the embodiment of discipline and duty. His place was at the gate, unmoving, a silent sentinel. But something about today was different. His eyes, trained to notice the smallest disturbances, caught sight of an elderly man near the gate. The man, slightly hunched, stood apart from the bustling crowd. His coat, though simple, was adorned with rows of gleaming medals, their luster reflecting years of valor and sacrifice. This was Arthur Bennett, though Elias didn't know his name yet. What drew Elias's attention, however, was not the man himself, but the group of rough-looking individuals lingering nearby. The men, 4 in total, were whispering and laughing in a way that set Elias on edge. One of them, a tall, burly figure with a scar across his jaw, pointed towards Arthur's medals. The others chuckled, their gazes narrowing. They moved closer, their predatory intent clear. Arthur adjusted his cane, his face calm but wary. The tall man smirked, stepping into his path. "Nice medals, Grandpa," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "You win those in a bingo game?" Arthur straightened as much as his frail frame allowed. "They're from my years of service," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of dignity. "Step aside." The man's smirk widened. "Service, huh? Maybe you should service me with one of those medals as a souvenir." Elias felt his jaw tighten. His training demanded stillness, but every fiber of his being urged him to act. He could see Arthur's knuckles whiten as he gripped his cane tighter. The old man's calm exterior was cracking. Elias made his decision. Breaking formation, he stepped forward, his boots echoing on the cobblestones. "Leave him alone," he commanded, his voice cutting through the air like steel. The men turned, startled. The tall one sneered, "And if we don't?" Elias's gaze locked on his, unwavering. "Then you'll wish you had." The tension in the air thickened as Elias stood his ground, his piercing gaze fixed on the group of men, daring them to test him. Tourists had fallen silent, their cameras forgotten as they watched the unfolding scene. Arthur Bennett, the elderly veteran, glanced at Elias, a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension in his weary eyes. The tall man let out a low chuckle, masking his uncertainty. "You're a guard, right? Big tough guy. Aren't you supposed to stand there and look pretty?" Elias didn't flinch. "I'm here to ensure peace. Harassing an unarmed man violates that." Another man from the group, stocky with a nervous twitch, muttered, "We don't want trouble." But the tall one waved him off, his bravado still intact. "We're just having some fun, officer. No harm in that." Arthur finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Mocking a man's service isn't fun. It's disgraceful." The tall man's smirk faltered. He reached out again, his hand aiming for one of Arthur's medals. "Let me get a closer look at this." Before he could finish, Elias moved. In a swift, fluid motion, he stepped between Arthur and the man, gripping the thug's wrist with a firm hand. "That's enough," Elias said, his voice low, commanding. The thug tried to pull back, but Elias's grip held steady. "Let go," the man snarled, his bravado cracking under the weight of Elias's unyielding presence. "If you touch him again, you'll regret it," Elias said, his tone calm but edged with warning. The surrounding tourists began murmuring, their phones now recording the exchange. The rest of the group hesitated, their confidence shaken as they saw the steely resolve in Elias's stance. The tall man finally jerked his hand free, glaring at Elias. "This isn't over," he spat before motioning to his crew to back off. The group slinked away, their hostility replaced by retreat. Arthur let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking up at Elias with gratitude. "You didn't have to step in, but you did." Elias turned to him, his expression softening. It was the right thing to do, sir. No one should have to endure that. As murmurs of admiration rippled through the onlookers, Elias caught sight of one of his fellow guards, signaling him from a distance. He knew what was coming. A breach of protocol always had consequences. For now, though, Elias stood beside Arthur, resolute. Rules could wait. Right had been done, and that was what mattered. The encounter at the palace gates seemed to fade into memory as the days passed. Elias returned to his post, standing tall and motionless as ever, but the confrontation lingered in his mind. The look in the thug's eyes, more than just anger, there had been a glint of something darker, more calculating. Arthur Bennett had left the palace grounds that day with a nod of gratitude, his medals still intact, his dignity preserved. But for Elias, unease remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. His suspicion was confirmed one evening when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was strained but calm. "It's Arthur," the old veteran said. "I hope I'm not troubling you, but there's been some strange activity around my apartment." Elias sat up, his grip tightening on the phone. "What kind of activity?" "Unfamiliar faces," Arthur replied. "Lingering near the building. My neighbors mentioned seeing the same men from the palace. They didn't approach me, but I can feel them watching." Elias's chest tightened. "Have you contacted the local authorities?" Arthur sighed. "I did. They said they'd send someone by, but nothing's come of it. I hate to bother you, son, but—" His voice trailed off, laced with quiet frustration. "You're not bothering me," Elias said firmly. "Stay indoors tonight. I'll come by as soon as my shift ends." True to his word, Elias arrived at Arthur's modest apartment that evening. The neighborhood was quiet, the soft hum of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Arthur opened the door with a faint smile, his cane steady in one hand. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let Elias in. Inside, the apartment was sparse but cozy. Medals and photographs lined the walls, telling stories of battles fought long ago. Arthur gestured for Elias to sit. "I'm probably overthinking this, right?" he began, settling into a worn armchair. "But after what happened at the palace—" "You're not overthinking," Elias interrupted gently. "Those men were trouble. If they followed you here, we can't ignore it." Arthur's eyes met his, a mix of gratitude and concern. "I don't want anyone else in harm's way because of me. You won't be alone in this," Elias promised. "I'll keep watch." That night, as Elias left Arthur's building, he scanned the street. For now, it was quiet, but the silence felt fragile. He resolved to stay vigilant. Whatever those men were planning, Elias wouldn't let them win. The following days were tense. Elias kept a watchful eye during his shifts, scanning every face in the crowd at Orion Palace. His mind frequently drifted to Arthur Bennett's quiet apartment, wondering if the lurking shadows had grown bolder. Then the storm finally broke. It was late afternoon when commotion erupted near the palace gates. A group of men stood shouting, their voices echoing against the grand stone walls. Elias recognized them immediately, the same thugs who had harassed Arthur. They were back, emboldened and angrier than before. "That's him," the tall one from before bellowed, pointing directly at Elias. "The so-called guard who attacked us for no reason." Tourists paused, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. The men weren't subtle in their approach, deliberately drawing attention as they demanded answers. Their leader sneered. "We want an apology. This guard went rogue. You need to discipline him." Elias remained stoic, his hands clasped behind his back. Inside, his blood boiled. The audacity of these men to return, not just to accuse him falsely, but to disrupt the sanctity of the palace grounds, was beyond reason. Captain Rosalind Quinn appeared moments later, her boots clicking sharply on the stone as she approached the scene. Flanked by two other guards, she addressed the men with a commanding tone. "This is Orion Palace property. You are trespassing. State your business clearly or leave immediately." The tall man folded his arms, attempting to look confident. Our business is justice. Your guard here assaulted us, without provocation, might I add. We're here to make sure he pays. Without provocation? A voice interjected, firm and laced with anger. Arthur Bennett stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. You harassed me, shoved me, and tried to rip these medals from my chest. And now you come here to demand justice? What a farce. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the tourists and onlookers. The thugs exchanged glances, their bravado slipping. Arthur continued, his voice rising. This young man defended me when I couldn't defend myself. If anyone deserves an apology, it's him. Captain Quinn's gaze shifted to Elias. Grant, do you have anything to add? Elias stepped forward, his expression resolute. These men were the aggressors. I acted to protect a civilian under threat, and I would do it again. Quinn nodded slowly, turning her attention back to the thugs. We have witness statements and security footage confirming the incident. You have no case here. You're trespassing on royal property, and if you don't leave immediately, you'll be charged. The men hesitated, their confidence shattered. The tall leader spat on the ground, glaring at Elias. This isn't over. He hissed before turning to leave, his companions trailing behind. As they disappeared into the crowd, the tension eased. Arthur let out a slow breath, his grip on his cane steady. You did well, son, he said quietly to Elias. Thank you for everything. Captain Quinn placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. You acted within your moral duty, Grant, but the spotlight is on us now. Be prepared for scrutiny. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. The thugs may have left, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Their return hinted at something larger, something darker, and he was determined to protect Arthur, no matter the cost. The threat Elias feared came to life under the cover of darkness. Days had passed since the confrontation at the palace, and while Arthur Bennett's days returned to quiet routine, Elias's unease only grew. Then, one late evening, his phone buzzed insistently, pulling him from restless sleep. They're here, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. Outside my apartment building. I've seen them through the window. Elias's heart surged. Stay inside, lock the doors, I'm on my way. He dressed in haste, his mind racing. Protocol be damned, Arthur was in danger. The streets of the city blurred as he sped toward the veteran's apartment, the distant hum of the city growing quieter with every turn. When Elias arrived, the building's dimly lit facade was still. Shadows loomed in the alleyways and faint murmurs carried through the air. He parked and made his way to the back entrance, where Arthur's voice had directed him. Inside, Elias found Arthur waiting in the corridor outside his apartment. He was clutching his cane, his expression firm but edged with fear. You should be inside, Elias said in a low voice. Arthur shook his head. This is my home. I won't cower while they try to take that from me. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps echoing in the stairwell. The voices grew louder, familiar jeers and mocking laughter. Elias motioned for Arthur to step back, his own posture shifting instinctively to one of readiness. The same men from before emerged, two of them carrying flashlights that swept the hallway. The tall leader wasn't among them, but the remaining thugs exuded the same arrogance. Well, one sneered, his flashlight landing on Elias. Looks like the hero guard is here, come to play savior again? You've made a mistake coming back, Elias said evenly. Leave now. The man laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. Not without what we came for. One lunged toward Arthur, his hand outstretched for the medals gleaming on the veteran's chest. Elias moved swiftly, intercepting the man mid-motion. His arm locked around the attacker's wrist, twisting it with just enough force to drop him to his knees. Another thug charged from behind, but Arthur, with surprising speed, tapped his cane against the floor, distracting him just long enough for Elias to pivot. A well-placed block sent the man stumbling backward. The remaining thug froze, caught between fight and flight. Sirens pierced the night, growing louder as backup. Both local police and palace security arrived. The thugs exchanged panicked glances before attempting to flee, but their efforts were futile. Within minutes, they were subdued, handcuffed, and taken away. Arthur leaned heavily on his cane, his breath unsteady. "You didn't have to come, son," he said softly, looking at Elias with gratitude and exhaustion. "I did," Elias replied, steadying the older man with a hand on his shoulder. "This fight isn't just yours." "Not anymore." As the police assured Arthur of his safety and left with the detained men, Elias remained by his side. The immediate threat was gone, but Elias knew this was far from over. The men weren't working alone, and their purpose wasn't as simple as intimidation. Arthur straightened, his metals catching the faint glow of a street lamp. "They may have come for these," he said, his voice quiet but strong, "but they'll never take what they represent." Elias nodded, his resolve deepening. "Not while I'm here." The next morning, Orion was abuzz with news of the arrests. The thugs detained at Arthur's apartment had been linked to a small but dangerous criminal ring. Their target? Veterans like Arthur. Individuals who seemed vulnerable but carried medals, stories, and often connections the criminals hoped to exploit for profit or intimidation. Arthur, however, had become their unexpected downfall. Elias stood at the palace gates, his posture as unyielding as ever, though his thoughts were far from still. The captain had commended his actions quietly, but the official review of his choices still loomed. Yet Elias wasn't concerned about his career. His mind was on Arthur's safety. Later that day, Arthur was invited to the palace for an update. The thugs had confessed to targeting him as part of a broader scheme. They had hoped to blackmail or humiliate him, believing his age and quiet demeanor would make him an easy mark. But with security footage, witness statements, and Elias's intervention, the case against them was airtight. As they walked the palace grounds together, Arthur seemed lighter, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by calm resolve. "This place," he said, gesturing to the towering walls, "once stood as a fortress of safety for men like me. It's good to know it still does." "You've earned that safety," Elias replied, walking beside him, "and you shouldn't have to fight for it again." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by Captain Rosalind Quinn, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Arthur, then turned her attention to Elias. "Grant," she said, her tone formal, "you'll be pleased to know the investigation into your actions has concluded. While breaking protocol is no small matter, the palace recognizes the moral courage you displayed in protecting Mr. Bennett. Your commendation will be issued during the official ceremony tomorrow." Elias blinked, caught off guard. "A commendation, ma'am?" Quinn's lips twitched in a rare smile. "Yes, while we enforce rules for a reason, sometimes breaking them is the only way to uphold what they stand for. You did your duty, and more." Arthur beamed at Elias. "I told you, son, doing the right thing doesn't go unnoticed." The next day, the ceremony was modest but meaningful. Arthur and Elias stood side by side, each recognized for their bravery. The thugs' threats had been extinguished, and the bonds forged between the aging veteran and the steadfast guard were celebrated by the small crowd gathered. As Captain Quinn pinned the commendation to Elias's chest, she spoke words that would stay with him forever. "A guard's duty is to protect the public, not just the palace. You've reminded us all of that." Arthur, now smiling brighter than Elias had ever seen, saluted him with the same respect he had shown his commanders in his youth. And in that moment, beneath the soaring towers of Orion Palace, justice had truly been served, not just for Arthur, but for the values he and Elias both stood for. The day after the ceremony, Orion Palace glowed under a golden sunrise. Life returned to its usual rhythm, tourists snapping photos, guards standing at their posts, and the city bustling beyond its gates. Yet for Elias Grant, everything felt different. The commendation pinned to his chest was more than a symbol of recognition. It was a reminder of the choices he had made. Breaking protocol, standing against injustice, and protecting Arthur Bennett. Each action had cemented his belief that a guard's duty went beyond ceremony. Arthur visited the palace that morning, his steps slow but steady, his cane tapping softly against the cobblestones. His medals gleamed proudly on his jacket, freshly polished for the occasion. The old veteran carried himself with a renewed sense of purpose, his earlier fears now replaced with quiet confidence. Elias spotted him from his post and stepped forward, meeting Arthur near the gates. "Mr. Bennett," he said with a respectful nod, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Arthur chuckled. "I had to come back, son. One last visit before I return to my quiet little apartment. Besides," he added, gesturing to the palace walls, "this place feels like home again." They walked together, pausing near the courtyard where the ceremony had taken place. Arthur leaned on his cane and gazed at the palace's spires. "You know," he began, his voice reflective, "when I first joined the service, I thought duty was all about orders and discipline. But as the years went on, I realized it's about people, standing up for them, protecting them." Elias nodded, his own thoughts mirroring Arthur's words. "That's what I've come to believe as well. Protocol has its place, but it's not everything." Arthur turned to face him, his expression serious. "You've got the heart of a true protector, Elias. Don't ever lose that, no matter how many rules get in the way." Elias felt a swell of pride, but he simply replied, "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." As the palace bells rang out, signaling the hour, Arthur straightened and saluted. Elias returned the gesture, their bond forged through shared values and mutual respect. Arthur finally turned to leave, his medals catching the light one last time. Before he disappeared into the bustling streets, he looked back at Elias. "You've got a bright future ahead, son. Don't let anyone dim it." Elias returned to his post standing tall and resolute, the weight of his responsibility now balanced by a renewed sense of pride. Tourists passed by, oblivious to the stories that had unfolded there, but Elias didn't mind. He knew what had happened, what had been won. Far in the distance, Arthur Bennett walked away, his figure fading into the city's endless motion. Yet his spirit remained, a testament to courage, honor, and the unyielding bond between a guard and the man he had sworn to protect. For Elias Grant, it wasn't just another day at the gates. It was the start of a legacy built not on rules, but on the unwavering belief that duty is, and always will be, about people. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.